All right, well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to our second Zoom session for PPA 670 policy analysis. I see there aren't a lot of us here yet, but I'm assuming your colleagues will be trickling in along the way. But since we are all here at 7 o'clock, I thought we'd go ahead and be rewarded for punctuality and get started right here at the top of the hour at 7. So welcome. It always is weird to say welcome to the second session when we're at the end of October, but that's kind of just the nature of the second half hybrid courses. And so it feels a little strange, but it is what it is. So this is only our second session. Let me first say thank you to everyone who posted your Beachboard essay number 1 along with responses to 2 classmates. So if you've posted all of that and you did that before about 6 o'clock today, I've already gone through and read your post and provided you with some feedback as well as a grade. Remember, for our weekly Beachboard essays, the way in which I'm grading them, they're out of 20 points total, 10 points for your initial response to my prompt, and then 5 points for each of your responses to classmates for a grand total of 20 points for the week. If you have not posted yet, please make sure to do that by this evening because it is due today, and I would hate to see you lose those points on the very first Beachboard essay. Just a comment about the Beachboard essays. I was happy with the quality of them. I think they were well written. I think that they expressed the problem very well and described the problem well. I didn't see any problems, no pun intended, with the societal problems that were identified in the Beachboard essays. I think they all will work very well for the course assignments here in 670. And so I think everyone's in good shape with their identification of their societal problem. It is important to recognize, though, that all of these problems that were mentioned in Beachboard number 1, in the policy world, they're all what we refer to as being wicked problems. And you may or may not have heard the term wicked problem before. But in policy analysis, a wicked problem is a problem that, number 1, is difficult, sometimes impossible, but difficult to solve. But it's also a problem where the solution for the problem will have consequences, what our economists would call externalities. So we'll have these unintended consequences that are sometimes very difficult to predict and to foresee. And that's what makes the problems wicked. You think you've got this solution that will solve this problem that you're focusing upon, but in solving this problem, you are then creating additional problems that you're going to have to deal with later on. And I think all the problems, for the most part, that were identified in the first Beachboard essay were what we consider to be these wicked problems, and that's expected. Because if you're selecting a problem that is easy to solve, we've probably already solved it, or at least we've mitigated enough so it's no longer deemed a societal problem. So I anticipate seeing wicked problems, and that's what I got. But again, so far, all the ones I reviewed, I think the feedback I've provided is, it's an important societal problem and that it will work for the course assignment. So I think we're off to a really good start with our Beachboard essays. Now, for next Thursday, you have 2 assignments that are due. You have your second Beachboard essay and responses to classmates. And for that second Beachboard essay, what you'll be doing is you'll be taking some of the information that we will be covering in the second half of class tonight, primarily some of the theoretical approaches to policy analysis. And so in the second half tonight, we'll talk about theories such as elite theory, pluralist theory, rational self-interest theory, institutional theory, political system theory. You'll be selecting at least one of those for your Beachboard number 2, and then talking about why that theoretical approach is appropriate for addressing your societal problem. So again, it's important we get through that second half information tonight so that you have the requisite information you need to do a good job then on Beachboard number 2. So by next Thursday night, you need to submit a response to my prompt there in Beachboard number 2, and of course, as always, responses to 2 classmates. Then you also have this first written assignment, your pre-instructional assignment, that is also going to be due next week. Remember, I decided to move that back to next week. And that is your background societal problem paper, whereby you are identifying your societal problem, You've already done that in Beachboard number 1. So if you're happy with your description in Beachboard number 1, I think you should be, because I think everyone did a good job. You can just take that and include that in your paper for next week. And so that becomes the first part of your paper. So you've already got that part done. That's the good news. So you have your description of your societal problem. Then you'll have a description of some of the major policies or rules or regulations that we have adopted to try and address that problem. Now, again, like I said last week, I don't want a laundry list, so don't feel that you have to give me every single policy that's been adopted regarding the problem. Just hit the highlights. So maybe 2 or 3 of the most important policies or rules or regulations that have been adopted to try and address the problem, and then a description of your stakeholders. Now, tonight, we will talk about stakeholders here in the first half of class and kind of give you an idea of who some of the stakeholders are in the policy process and what some of their motivations might be. And we'll have a slide tonight where we'll talk about primary versus secondary stakeholders. So you'll get that information for the paper tonight. So again, the paper you're turning in for your pre-instructional will have a title page, the description of your societal problem, which you've already done for Beachboard number 1, a description of a couple of the major policies and rules and regulations addressing that problem, and then a description of your stakeholders, and then followed by a reference page for any references that you use in the construction of the paper. Again, it's a very concise paper. We're looking at 3 to 5 pages, so try and use parsimony and try and keep the paper as concise as you possibly can. So next week, Beachboard essay number 2, and then this pre-instructional assignment, both due next Thursday. Are there any questions about either of those assignments due next Thursday?
Hi, Professor. I have a question about the paper that's due next Thursday. Did you want us using like the background, problem statement, and stakeholders as our headings for that paper, or can we kind of write it, as long as we include all the information?
That's a great question. My preference, again, I'm not going to mark anyone down if they don't do this. My preference is to use those as your headings. And so you can give me a societal problem and then the description. Give me current policy approaches, however you want to call it, and that'll be your second part. Give me a heading for stakeholders for your third part. I think that helps you organize the paper. It also helps me in my grading of the paper. So I certainly recommend that you do that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, great point. Okay, anybody else, or are we good to go?
I have a quick question for the sources and the references that we're using. I know at some point in the class, there's a certain amount of peer-reviewed articles that we have to have. Is there a required amount for this first paper?
Good question. Not for the first paper, no. Yeah, when you get to your second paper, you will have to have a minimum of 6 sources. For this first paper, no. It just depends on how you're writing the paper and the information that you're using. I would assume probably in your description of your societal problem, you may have a source in there somewhere. Maybe when you're talking about the current policies or regulations that affect the problem, you got that information from somewhere. And so you'll probably have a reference there, but there's no minimum. I would think probably no more than a handful probably would be sufficient. Yeah, Frank, question in text chat, can we confirm what kind of references we can use? My preference is always for scholarly sources. And so when you get to your second paper with that annotated bibliography approach, all 6 of those sources should be either from scholarly peer-reviewed journals or from credible, respected government sites. Now, sometimes we have to be careful with those government sites these days, but they should all be those types of scholarly, credible types of sources. And so, when you're dealing in the world of public administration, you've probably dealt with this before in some of your previous courses, but some of the scholarly peer-reviewed journals we tend to see in PA are things like Public Administration Review, Public Budgeting and Finance, American Review of Public Administration. Those are some of the, again, there are a lot of others, but those are some of the big ones in public administration. Political science, you got American Political Science Review as really kind of the granddaddy of them all, if you will, in political science. And intergovernmental relations, you have Publius. But really what we're looking for is we're looking for primarily those scholarly journals that have a peer-reviewed process. And you've probably talked about peer review, I'm assuming, in a previous class, but if not, just very quickly, if you want to know whether or not a journal is a peer-reviewed journal, there are a couple of different ways you can do it. One simple way that's not foolproof, so you have to be careful with it, but whenever you're using electronic database from the library, you can tell the database to only search peer-reviewed journals. That's kind of a screening device that you can use. Now, sometimes that screening device is certainly not going to be perfect. And sometimes some journals may slip through that perceptual screen without really being peer-reviewed. But usually it does a pretty decent job of narrowing your search down to peer-reviewed journals. The other way that you can do it is if you are using an electronic source, which almost everyone is. Very few people are going to go to the library, even if you can these days, and pull a hard copy of Public Administration Review. You're not going to do that. You're going to be getting it online. When you're using an electronic source, one thing that you can do is you can go to the publisher's website and click on, they'll always have a link that says manuscript submission guidelines or something to that effect. Click on that and read what the manuscript submission guidelines are. And if the manuscript submission guidelines say that it's a peer-reviewed process, that the manuscript comes in on an anonymous basis, gets sent out to 3 to 5 reviewers for their review, again, on a blind referee process where it's anonymous, then you've got what you consider to be a peer-reviewed type of journal. So we're hoping most of those will come from those types of journals. Okay. But again, very good question. As we go through the rest of our week from today until next Thursday, as you're working on this paper, if you have any other questions that pop up, feel free to send me an email, and I'm more than happy to answer any questions that you have. Don't hesitate to ask questions, because if you've got the question, probably at least half the rest of the class has the exact same question, just didn't ask it. So feel free to send me an email, and I'm happy to help clarify any questions you might have. So that's basically what we're going to be doing for next week. This week, tonight, what we're hoping to do is I'm going to kind of split the session up into a first half and a second half. And the first half of the session, we are going to talk about government institutions and policy actors. And subsumed within that will be a discussion of stakeholders. And I want to get this done in the first half of class so that you will then have all the information you need to do your pre-instructional assignment. Then we'll take a brief break, and then after our break in our second half of class, we'll talk about the theoretical approaches to the study of policy, to policy analysis. And that's when we'll talk about elite theory and pluralist theory and rational choice theory, present all those theoretical approaches for you in the second half of class, that you can then take that information and use that information then to work on your second beach board essay. So important information tonight, both in the first as well as the second half of the class. We'll see how we progress. I know I told you last week, I don't want to be talking as much as I talked last week. But again, this is information I really want you to get before you have these next 2 assignments coming up, the beach board number 2, as well as your problem background paper, what if we're calling it background stakeholders paper. I really want you to get that information tonight. So we'll make sure we cover that information. If we do have some time remaining after that and we're not all too tired, I do have a breakout group type of exercise that we can do to let you break out in groups and kind of not have to listen to me for a few minutes. So that's our plan of attack for this evening. So let's go ahead and jump into our discussion of government institutions and policy actors. And just to go back to the beginning, the foundings of the nation in the late 1700s, we know that at the founding of the nation, the primary job belonged to state governments. We know that state governments were very active in establishing the Constitution at the Constitutional Convention. The delegates were at the convention representing their states. And so states really argued that they should be the repository of power. And at the beginning, the national government was very small and didn't have a whole lot of duties. But as we move through the 1800s, we see this sometimes gradual, but other times pronounced expansion of the United States. As the United States starts to expand westward, the United States also starts to expand the size and the scope of the national government. One reason why we saw this tremendous expansion in the size of the national government in the 1800s was what's known as crisis theory. Crisis theory, just like it sounds, goes that whenever there is a major crisis, someone or something needs to respond to that crisis. And so government steps in and responds to the crisis. Whether the crisis be the War of 1812, or if the crisis is the Civil War, or the crisis is the poor working conditions for employees, or unsafe food and unsafe pharmaceutical medication. Maybe the crisis could be the Spanish flu. The crisis could be the stock market crash and the Great Depression. Whenever we have this crisis, we tend to see the national government get involved and do things that otherwise were left to either to the states or to the private sector. And so one primary reason for this expansion of government activity is this crisis theory. Now, typically, you would assume that once the crisis is averted and the crisis goes away, that national government activity would then return to its normal pre-crisis level. But we all know here in this country that doesn't happen, that increased level of activity on the part of the national government once the crisis is over tends to remain and doesn't go back to its original level of activity. Because once government gets involved in regulating some type of behavior or providing some type of a good or service, the public kind of come to accept it, that is a proper thing for government to do. If you think about in the late 1800s, we had this huge expansion of national government power and authority through their expansion of authority over interstate commerce with the Interstate Commerce Commission, expansion of authority over workplace safety, as I said before, over food safety, over pharmaceutical drug safety. And we see all these different aspects of the economy begin to be regulated actively by the national government. And once the national government does that type of regulation for a while, people get used to it and they begin to accept it. When you have public acceptance of the government's regulation of business, you can anticipate having more of that regulation in the future. We do know the primary reason for growth in government came with the New Deal. Stock market crash in the late 1920s and the Great Depression. When the Great Depression hits, FDR comes into office, election in 1932, and brings with him his New Deal approach to trying to pull the economy out of the doldrums of the Great Depression, to provide assistance to state and local governments, to help them pull themselves out of the doldrums of the Great Depression. Because of that New Deal approach of FDR, that's when you see the national government creating all these new agencies and all these new policies in order to, again, address the problems of the Great Depression. Now, the counterbalance or the counterweight to this great expansion of national government policymaking is obviously the presence of the 10th Amendment. As we all know, because we're all students of our Constitution, the first 10 amendments to the Constitution are the Bill of Rights, and that 10th Amendment to the Constitution is known as the Reserved Powers Amendment. The Reserved Powers Amendment says that all the powers that are not explicitly given to Congress by the Constitution, nor denied to the states, all those remaining powers then belong to either the states and or the people. So we're reserving everything that we've not explicitly given to Congress in the national government, the Constitution. we are going to reserve all those powers that have not been mentioned, and we're going to reserve them for the states and or the people. So the 10th Amendment throughout our history has always been there as the counterbalance to this natural progression of national government power to kind of serve as a check on national government power. The problem that we saw is that the ultimate arbiter of this balance of power is the US Supreme Court. And when FDR started to promulgate all these new national policies to address the Great Depression, there's a great expansion of national authority, and the Supreme Court objected to it. Case after case went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said, no, you can't do this. This is unconstitutional. This is a violation of the 10th Amendment to the Constitution. FDR's response, for all you historians out there, you know his response was, well, I'll engage in court packing, which is interesting because we heard after the most recent presidential election a lot of talk about court packing again. So we're talking about it again. But this is something FDR said, I'll pack the court. So I'll take the court from 9 up to 15 members. So I'll have all these additional Supreme Court justices that I can appoint that will then swing the balance of power on the court over toward justices who favor my New Deal programs and policies. Well, he never did pack the court, but that threat of court packing was a watershed moment for the Supreme Court, because once we had that court packing threat, then cases that came after that, suddenly the court stopped standing in the way. And the court, where previously they would say this is an unconstitutional abuse of power, now after the court packing threat, they will acquiesce to it. And so that's how all these New Deal policies really got sanctioned, if you will, through Supreme Court review. So it's the Supreme Court that decides this proper balance between expansion of national government power and this recognition of states' rights and state power under the Reserve Powers Amendment, the 10th Amendment. So it's really up to the Supreme Court. And we saw after this court packing threat, all the way up through, really up to the 80s and the 90s, the Supreme Court was very unwilling to check national policymaking power. It really wasn't until the Rehnquist Court in the 1990s where the Supreme Court really stood up and said, enough is enough, and we need to start providing some protection to states given to them under the 10th Amendment. It was in, not to digress too much, but it was in 1992, Sandra Day O'Connor in a case called New York versus US, where she actually, in writing the majority opinion, said the 10th Amendment is just as important as all the other amendments in the Bill of Rights. It's just as important as the First Amendment, the Second Amendment, and all the rest of these amendments. But when you do have this great expansion of national policy-making power and authority, and this great growth of government, it means that you're going to have more national policies. And so things that used to be policies left to the private sector or to state governments, now these become national policies. And so with all these new national policies, there's more of an imperative for us to study those policies, more of a justification for a policy analysis course like we handle here in this MPA program. But as I mentioned on the last slide, one reason why we have this growth in national power and national policy making is because of crisis theory. And we said once the crisis is averted, we never see that original level of activity return, that we kind of now created a new level of expectation for government activity, and we just move up from there. That's the thing known as expectancy theory, that once government, any level of government, gets involved in providing or producing a good or service that people become reliant upon, they will continue to expect government to provide and produce that service in the future. As people expect government to do it, government then has to respond and continue to do it. That's expectancy theory. It's going to be very interesting to see here as hopefully we start to move into a more post-pandemic world. Again, I'm being optimistic here, and I'm saying hopefully. So move into the post-pandemic world, it's going to be interesting to see what happens with expectancy theory in terms of all these programs and policies that were put in place to help people deal with the negative effects of the pandemic. So things such as, the stimulus payments here in the state of California, the advanced child care payments at the federal level, the unemployment assistance. As we move into the post-pandemic world, we've now created expectations that people will continue to expect getting those services and those programs and policies. It'll be interesting to see if government is able to say no, or if we'll continue to see government throughout the future continue to provide and produce these types of goods and services. So it'll be very interesting to watch that from a policy perspective. Now, we also know that our system of government is predicated upon a fragmentation of power and authority. We know we fragment power and authority horizontally as well as vertically. We fragment power horizontally through separation of powers, and we fragment it vertically through our system known as federalism. Both separation of powers and federalism have profound implications for policy-making processes and policy-making capacity. When you think, and we'll talk about both of those in turn, but just think about just quickly right now, separation of powers. When you are dividing power horizontally between an executive, a legislative, and a judicial branch, when that executive and legislative branch are dominated by different political parties, you have what's called divided government. And the norm in this country is divided government. Now, currently, today, we don't technically have divided government. We have a Democratic president. We have the House controlled by the Democratic Party, albeit by much smaller margins than we saw back in 2018. And we have a Senate that's pretty much, it is evenly split, but because we have a Democratic vice president who serves as the president of the Senate, the Democratic vice president can come in and vote in case of a tie. So technically, we have unified government. That's unusual. That's atypical. Usually we have divided government, branches controlled by different political parties. You can imagine when you have divided government, how difficult it then becomes to do policy making. And we'll show you some examples tonight about some of the difficulties we're having, even with a technically unified government, in getting policy through Congress, approved by Congress and by the president. But before we get into that, let's look more at this vertical type of fragmentation of power that we call American federalism. And again, there are entire courses that are taught on American federalism. And we have one in our program that is offered in the summer session called Intergovernmental Relations. And if you haven't taken that, but you're interested in federalism and intergovernmental relations, this is my plug, my commercial now. I would strongly recommend you think about it. It's offered in the third summer session, and it usually fills up pretty quickly. It's an elective, and we offer it in an asynchronous modality. So it allows you to work throughout the summer at your own pace to do the assignments. But just about every MPA program will have a course on federalism and intergovernmental relations. Most policy programs will also have that type of a course because it's that important of a concept for policymaking. So let's talk a little bit about federalism and how it affects policy. So we're looking at federalism, as you all know, we're looking at the division of power and responsibility between different levels of government. Under the original US Constitution, we had two levels of government, the national government and the state government. Local governments were not included in the US Constitution, but local governments do get protection in individual state constitutions. And so we usually have to talk about local governments as well in this vertical division of power. So when we talk about local governments in addition to national and state governments, that's when we usually say intergovernmental relations. So that's kind of the difference. When we say constitutional federalism, it's only national and state. When we say intergovernmental relations, we include all three levels of government. But this idea of federalism and intergovernmental relations is a dynamic concept because the way in which it's embodied in the Constitution, as we know, the Constitution is a series of compromises. And so the compromises that the framers had to make, primarily James Madison, when he wrote the Constitution, those compromises lay out some ambiguity in terms of which level of government should be dominant, which level of government should have most power. You look at Article 6 of the Constitution, you have the Supremacy Clause. And the Supremacy Clause says that the Constitution, laws, and treaties of the United States are the supreme law of the land, meaning that when a national constitution comes into conflict with a state constitution, the national constitution wins. That's a very strong pronouncement of national government power. But then when you look at something like the 10th Amendment, the Reserve Powers Amendment, here we're saying if it's a power we're not given specifically to the national government, all those other powers are then reserved for the states. And so that's a very strong pronouncement of states' rights and state authority. So again, we've got these conflicting sections of the Constitution, if you will, which then leaves federalism open to interpretation. And we have interpreted the proper balance of power between the different levels of government differently, depending upon the period of time in which we are looking. So on the screen there for you, what I've done is I've just listed what we assume are the different eras of federalism. And again, different Federalist scholars will use different terms for these eras. These are the terms that I tend to use. They're kind of the accepted nomenclature when you're talking about federalism. So from the founding of the nation until the Civil War, we had our first era of federalism known as dual federalism. In dual federalism, the national and state governments had their own power, responsibilities, and spheres of influence, and they were separate. So the national government did its thing, state governments did their thing, and really never the two shall meet. The national sphere of influence was much smaller than the state sphere of influence. So if you're drawing this kind of as a Venn diagram, kind of an approximation of a Venn diagram, you would have a small circle of power for the national government and then a separate larger circle of power for state governments. And that really was true up to the Civil War. After the Civil War, the argument that Southern states made that the states created the Union, so therefore the states could leave the Union, that argument was, for all intents and purposes, dead after the Civil War. So after the Civil War, we moved from what we call dual federalism to competitive federalism. In competitive federalism, the national and state governments are still separate, but the sphere of influence for the national government grows and the sphere of influence for the state government shrinks. This is a period of what we refer to in game theory as zero-sum game. That if one party increases its power, it does so de facto at the detriment of the other party. So the national government's going to expand its power over things such as, again, workplace safety and food safety and interstate commerce. It's going to do that by taking those powers away from the state government. And that's what we saw in this era of competitive federalism, running from the end of the Civil War up to the New Deal. Then when we get into FDR's New Deal, we move from what's called competitive federalism to what we call cooperative federalism, where instead of competing with each other for power, now we see a cooperative relationship where the national government, through these policies being created by FDR, are now giving assistance. The national government's now giving assistance to state and local governments to help them deal with the problems of the Great Depression. We see the grant and aid programs start to develop through what we call cooperative federalism. And that period runs from the 1930s, from the New Deal, up into the 1960s. And again, it's this cooperative approach to policy making. We get into the mid-1960s. We get into the Lyndon Johnson administration, and we have a very brief era of federalism called creative federalism. And creative federalism is essentially the Johnson administration. So from the assassination of JFK up to the inauguration of Richard Nixon in 1969. Lyndon Johnson, in the creative federalism period of time, really felt that policy making should be done in Washington, D.C. That it's a responsibility of the national government to make policy, to establish goals and objectives, and then use tools to get state and local governments to achieve those national objectives, basically to induce state and local governments to achieve national objectives. It's called creative federalism because Johnson used creative tools such as categorical grants and mandates in order to induce state and local governments to do the national government's bidding. But it's very much a focus on national policy making. When Nixon comes in office in 1969, he brings in with him a completely diametrically opposed approach to federalism. So instead of using what we call creative federalism, we now start using what he called new federalism. And new federalism really inverted the relationship and said policymaking shouldn't happen at the national level. Policymaking should happen at the level of government that is closest to citizens, the local level. Who knows best what's in the best interest of their citizens than the local government? Washington, D.C. doesn't know. Washington, D.C. doesn't know what's in the best interest of the citizens of Long Beach, California. It's the local government of Long Beach that knows what's in the best interest of its citizens. So Long Beach city government should be primarily the policymakers in this relationship. Not only did Richard Nixon believe in new federalism, but so did Ronald Reagan. In the 1980s, Ronald Reagan revived new federalism using a lot of these things they call block grants instead of categorical grants. So what's the difference here in these tools between a block and a categorical grant? Categorical grant is a very specific grant of money that has to be used in a very specific way. So you have a lot of reporting requirements and you're held accountable to make sure you're spending that money in the way the national government tells you to spend it. By contrast, a block grant is more general in nature. So the block grant, you receive money from the national government and you can spend that money how you see fit, as long as how you are spending that money will help you accomplish your policy goals. So if you've got the example I usually use in federalism is you have a program, a national program for the education of at-risk youth. You can, with a block grant, spend that national money on things such as, after-school programs, midnight basketball programs, counseling programs, even job training programs. You can spend it how you see fit, as long as how you're spending it will help you achieve the ultimate goal of educating at-risk youth. Another good example from the policy world is welfare policy reform in the 1990s. In the 1990s, in welfare reform, we have this shift from AFDC grants to what we call temporary assistance to needy family grants, or TANF grants. Those TANF grants are block grants. States could use that block grant money how they saw fit, as long as how they use that money helped them move people from welfare roles into gainful employment. So if you could document that spending this money helped move people from welfare to work, then you were allowed to spend the money how you saw fit. That's what we call a block grant. So clearly the block grant is a great tool if you believe in new federalism. The categorical grant is the tool you would use if you believe in creative federalism. And then the sister term to grants is what are called mandates. And some of you in your daily life may live with mandates. A mandate is essentially an order from a parent government to take a certain type of action or do something. And there are lots of different types of mandates. We're not going to get into them here because we have a lot of information to cover. But again, if you're interested in that, we do that in the intergovernmental relations class. But a mandate is kind of the stick approach. A grant is the carrot approach. But they're both meant to induce compliance on the part of state and local governments. So as you can see, the way in which we interpret the relationship between national, state, and local governments really has changed over the different generations. Today, I like to say that we're in an era of federalism known as contextual federalism, where our belief in which level of government should be dominant really depends upon the issue. So for some issues, you'll see presidential administration say this should be something the national government should be doing. On other issues, that same administration will say this is something that the state government should be responsible for. But the important part of this and the upshot of all this is that when you believe that the state governments should be the ones making policy as opposed to the national government, that's going to lead to a lot of variation in the policy approaches that you get. So when you decentralize this policy-making power down to state governments, you're going to get a lot of variation in policy approaches. Just there are literally thousands of examples, but just to be contemporary, take the example of mask and vaccine mandates here in California and compare those to mask and vaccine mandates in the state of Texas. I went several months ago. I moved my son into a new apartment in Houston, and spent some time in Texas. And I'll tell you, the differences are stark when you go from California to Texas. I went from Los Angeles County, where there's a mask requirement indoors everywhere you go, to Texas, where you don't see a mask in sight in a lot of areas in Texas. So you get that type of variation when you leave policy making to the work of state governments as opposed to the federal government. Obviously, when you centralize that policy making at the national level, that's when you get a lot more uniformity in your approaches. We do know with our system of federalism, we have this sharing of power and responsibility in policy making across different levels of government. What that oftentimes does is it makes it difficult for us to hold governments and people and organizations responsible and accountable for their actions. It's difficult for us to know who is responsible and accountable for a policy that we may disagree with. I spent the last 6 years on a local school board, and the very end of my tenure was the beginning of the COVID pandemic. And so we moved online. All 15 schools and all 10,000 of our students moved online, just like most educational institutions did. And we heard it from parents. And parents came in and said, you should not be remote. Our kids should be in school. They should be physically in school without masks. And our response would be, well, that's not our call as a local school board. We've been told to do this by the state of California. We've been told to do this by the local county of health. Local health agency in the county. It's not our decision to make, but people didn't realize that, or didn't care that it wasn't the school district's job to make that decision. We had no choice. We were compelled to follow these orders from the state or from county government. So sometimes it's difficult for voters and citizens to know to whom they should hold accountable and responsible. Then we also know policymaking is greatly influenced by the horizontal fragmentation of power through separation of powers, executive, legislative, and judicial branches. In the legislative branch, we know that there is further fragmentation of policymaking power even within Congress itself. You know that one of the genius moments, I guess, if you will, the great compromise that we got of a bicameral legislature. The Constitutional Convention, we had the Virginia plan, which was proportional representation. We had the New Jersey plan, which was equal representation. Then we got the Connecticut Compromise. Why don't we create two different houses of Congress, a House of Representatives and an upper body, a Senate, and we have proportional representation in the House, and we have equal representation in the Senate. So this bicameral Congress makes it difficult for us to make policy. And one of the reasons is because those two bodies, the House and the Senate, function very differently from each other. The House is a very centralized type of legislative body, where if you're a new member of the House of Representatives, you are literally what they would call in England a backbencher, which means that you probably are not going to get the plum committee assignment. You're probably not going to have a whole lot of influence. You're not going to be on the Rules Committee or any of these committees that determine what gets considered on the floor and how it gets considered. You have very little power as a new member of the House. Contrast that to the Senate, which is a much more egalitarian body, where if you're a brand new senator, you ostensibly have the same amount of power as a senator who may have been there for 40 or 50 years. For a bill to get to the floor of the Senate, you need to have what's called a unanimous consent agreement. You have to have the agreement of all the senators that they will allow this bill to go to the floor of the Senate. If even one senator stands up and says no, that bill will at least be delayed in getting to the floor. And with certain policies recently, we've seen that. We've seen Senator Rand Paul from Kentucky, who has stood up and objected to a bill going to the floor of the Senate. Josh Hawley, we've seen do the same type of thing from Missouri. However, in the House, for a bill to get to the floor of the House, it goes through the Rules Committee. The Rules Committee is dominated by the party that's in the majority. And so the Democrats currently have the majority on the Rules Committee, and so they can force something onto the floor of the House over the objections of the Republicans. And we frequently see bills pass through the House that are passed with absolutely zero votes from any Republican members of the House. In the Senate, it's a lot more difficult. And another thing that complicates policymaking in the Senate is this idea of the filibuster. And you're probably all familiar with the filibuster, that a member of the Senate can stop the consideration of a policy or a piece of legislation. And in order to move that legislation forward, you need to get at least 60 votes. So you can get up there and you can read from the Washington, D.C. phone book if you want, in order to slow down the consideration of a policy that you disagree with. And in order to break that logjam and break that filibuster that you are doing, you have to get what's called a vote of cloture. It's C-L-O-T-U-R-E, cloture. And that vote of cloture takes the agreement of 60 members of the Senate. So the Senate is much more deliberative, I guess you would say, much more potential for gridlock in the Senate than what we oftentimes see in the House. And we're seeing this currently from a policy perspective in the most recent Biden bill that's trying to make its way through the Senate. It's a huge piece of legislation. Right now, the last price tag I saw was $1.75 trillion, which is actually scaled down from what was originally going to be $4 to $6 trillion. But the bill's being held up, even though the Democrats, with the vote of Vice President Harris, have a majority. The problem is they have two senators, Senator Manchin from West Virginia and Senator Sinema from Arizona, who are objecting to pieces of that legislation, parts of that legislation. And so even though the Democrats ostensibly have control in the Senate, they have not been able to get those two Democrats to join in voting for that bill. And so they're short of the majority that they need to pass it through the Senate. And so you kind of get the idea of how policymaking can be a little bit more fraught in the Senate than what we oftentimes see in the House of Representatives. So Congress has this internal fragmentation. Congress also has its powers fragmented based upon the Constitution itself. And again, I'm not going to make this a constitutional law class. I'm sure if you've taken 500, you've gone through the Constitution and talked about some of these things before. But Article 1, Section A of the Constitution is really important here, because Article 1, Section A of the Constitution is where we lay out the powers of this Congress. We have enumerated powers in that in Article 1, Section 8, we list specific powers for Congress. And at the end of Article 1, Section 8, we have the elastic clause, that Congress shall make all laws necessary and proper for carrying the execution of the foregoing powers and all other powers vested in the Congress by the Constitution. Meaning that Congress can do whatever it thinks is necessary in order to carry out the powers that we have listed for it in Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution. So enumerated powers and the elastic clause are in conflict with each other. Because when you were to read the enumerated powers, by enumerating or listing powers, you are by definition limiting those powers. Because the implication is, if we say you can establish post offices and you can declare war and you can regulate interstate commerce, you can only do those things because they're listed, they're enumerated. Everything else that's not listed, you don't have the power to do. But then in the elastic clause at the end of Article 1, Section 8, we said, but you can do anything necessary and proper in order to carry out these other powers. So you've got that type of fragmentation of authority built into the Constitution itself that sometimes makes policy making difficult in Congress as well. The fragmentation of authority in Congress, as we said, is profound. We know that Congress operates based upon the guidance of elected leadership. So in the House of Representatives, we have a Speaker of the House, we have a Majority Leader, we have a Minority Leader. In the Senate, we have a Majority Leader, we have a Minority Leader, we have Deputy Leaders, we have whips. These are all your elected leadership. And these elected leaders come from one of the two political parties. So the Democrats control the House of Representatives, and so the Speaker is a Democrat, the Majority Leader is a Democrat, the Minority Leader is a Republican, and the same type of deal over in the US Senate. So the powers and structure within the Congress is really predicated upon political parties. And so what we've seen recently in policy is that our political parties have become so polarized and have moved to the opposite ends of the political spectrum that's really hollowed out the middle ground where most policy gets made. And so some of the policies that are coming out of the Democratic Party are very liberal / progressive policies. Policies coming out of the Republican Party tend to be very conservative policies, not a whole lot of room in the middle for a lot of policy negotiation. The executive branch, we know from our high school civics courses or AP government courses, we know that ostensibly the executive branch is responsible for the implementation, the execution of these laws and these policies that are passed by the legislative branch. We know that in the executive branch, the primary management arm for all of this is what's called the Executive Office of the President, or the EOP. The Brown-Lowe Commission and the Reorganization Act of the federal government back in the 1930s and 40s established this Executive Office of the President and then populated it with management-oriented agencies. All of these agencies within the Executive Office of the President, as well as agencies outside the EOP, not only engage in policy implementation, but they also engage in policy formulation and policy making as well. We'll talk more about that as we go through tonight, but we know that policies aren't only made in formulation in Congress, that someone needs to implement those, and how those policies get implemented, all those details come from the rulemaking process, and that rulemaking gets done by these executive branch organizations. The U.S. bureaucracy, because these bureaucratic organizations, whether they be cabinet level departments or independent agencies or independent regulatory commissions, they are also engaged in policy making on a daily basis. And again, they're engaged in policy making primarily through the rulemaking process. So policy formulation occurs in the executive branch as well as the legislative branch. But the executive branch is also fragmented because we've got all these different organizations, different types of organizations that all have a different vested interest in the outcome of this policy process. Then obviously our third branch is the judicial branch. Primary difference with the judicial branch is you don't have members of the federal judiciary who are elected as opposed to what you see in the legislature. They are appointed positions. They are appointed for life or good behavior. And the judicial branch doesn't really proactively make policy. Congress proactively makes policy. The White House and executive branch organizations actively make policy. The judicial branch is much more reactive. You know, the old adage in the judicial branch is that the courts don't find cases, cases find the courts. The courts are not going to take the initiative to go out there and find cases to rule upon. They wait until the cases come to them, and then they make rulings on those cases once they receive them. Those rulings are oftentimes made based upon precedent, what we call in the legal world stare decisis, that they really do tend to look at what they've done in the past and use that precedent for making decisions on contemporary cases. Now, that's not always the case. And one of the concerns about the judicial branch these days is just how political the judicial branch may be becoming. We know that the president appoints federal judges, appoints judges to the district court, to the courts of appeal, as well as nominates members of the Supreme Court. It's interesting to watch cases make their way up through the federal judicial system, where you will have a case decided one way by a federal district trial judge, and then decided a completely different way by a circuit court of appeals. And then you go back and you look at who appointed that district judge versus who appointed those members of the circuit court of appeals. And oftentimes you'll see they were appointed by presidents from different parties, which is concerning from a policy perspective when you have that much of a political influence that tends to be permeating even your judicial branch, which at least in theory at the federal level is supposed to be as apolitical as possible. So those are kind of your formal actors in the policy process. But we also realize we have informal policy actors as well. Public opinion has a big influence upon policy. It can influence which policies make it onto the formal decision-making agenda. It can influence how we formulate and create these policies, how we legitimize these policies, how we implement these policies. So public opinion really is a major force throughout the entire policy process. Public opinion, you can divide it up between what we call attentive and general public opinion. The general public opinion is just kind of this opinion that is floating around out there in the general public, but the general public really isn't paying very close attention. Then you have the attentive public. The attentive public are oftentimes more your stakeholders in the policy process. They're the ones who are most interested in the policy. They're the ones who are going to research the policy, and they will understand more about what the societal problem is that's trying to be solved and how that proposed policy will solve the societal problem. So oftentimes it's really this attentive public opinion that is sometimes more important than just general public opinion. We all know we have interest groups, what James Madison referred to as factions in Federalist Paper number 10. These interest groups obviously have an impact upon policy as well. Organized interest groups like the NRA or the AARP, big influences on the policy process. Nonprofit organizations are also involved in the policy-making process. Nonprofit organizations not only influence and affect policy, but they are also influenced and affected by policy. They make policy, they influence policy, they're affected by policy, and they're subject to those policy regulations and rules and stipulations as well. Lobbying is a big part of policy making, and we know that there are thousands of organizations that are registered with Congress as lobbyists, and they lobby members of Congress. But they not only lobby members of Congress in policy formulation, they also lobby executive officials as well, those who are implementing those policies. Because again, to get a policy passed through a fragmented Congress, that policy needs to be relatively vague and ambiguous, as we talked about last week. So all those ambiguous elements of that policy will make it difficult to implement because we don't have a whole lot of specifics about how we're actually supposed to implement that policy. We leave the specifics then to the administrators who will be implementing that policy. So in that rulemaking process governed by the Administrative Procedures Act, we'll have a lot of this lobbying going on through the public comment period. So whenever an agency wants to make a change to the rules that govern the implementation of a policy, they must post that proposed change, and then they must hold a period of public comments where all these nonprofit organizations and interest groups can come in and speak and lobby for the changes that they would like to see. The media serves another very important informal policy actor. We know that the media, even though we consider it to be an informal policy actor, have constitutional protections in the First Amendment to the Constitution. We have a freedom of press. We know we have freedom of speech. But media outlets really do play a major role in influencing public opinion. And then that public opinion has a major influence upon our policies. We know that today, more than ever, we are inundated with a lot of different media sources. And it's more imperative today than ever that the public become informed consumers of this information and make sure that the information that they are consuming is credible and verifiable information to then use in forming their public opinions. We also know that we have these, what we call issue networks today. And so in the past, we had what we call iron triangles. And the iron triangle, if you remember back to your undergraduate American government class, spoke to the relationship between interest groups, bureaucratic agencies, and members of Congress. Today, instead of these iron triangles, we have what we call issue networks. And issue networks is a term that was coined by an author named Hugh Heclo, Heclo, several years ago. And the issue network says that we're going to have different networks of individuals and groups depending upon the issue. So if we're looking at gun control legislation, we'll have an issue network for gun control policy. You know, the NRA may be involved in there, and then pro-gun control groups will be involved in there. You know, state attorney generals may be involved in there, U.S. Attorney General, U.S. Justice Department. So we may have a different network for that issue than what we might have for an issue like homelessness. So we've got these issue networks that influence our policymaking process as well. And sometimes these networks do become very highly specialized, in that they really focus on that one policy area, or maybe even a sliver or a part of that one policy area. So all these individuals and all these groups that we have talked about, they're examples of stakeholders in our policies. Stakeholders can oftentimes be divided into the categories of primary versus secondary stakeholder. A primary stakeholder is a person or a group that will have a much more tangible, direct role, or will be affected in a much more tangible and direct way than someone else. And so if you've got something like a general assistance program, where it's a direct cash transfer of money from the state to eligible households, the members of that eligible household that will be receiving that direct cash transfer, they are clearly what we would consider to be primary stakeholders, because they are affected on a daily basis by this policy. The agencies, state agencies that are responsible for implementing this policy, they probably would also fall into that primary stakeholder category, because their jobs are really dependent upon the success of this policy. If this general assistance, this cash transfer policy is not successful and it is then eliminated, their jobs may go away. Their entire agency may go away. So they have a very tangible and direct interest in this general assistance program. In terms of the secondary level of stakeholders, you may have local businesses. You know, they have a stake in this policy as well, because if the state government is transferring money into the accounts of these eligible households, they are increasing the disposable income of those households. If those households have additional disposable income, what are they going to do? They're going to go out there and they're going to spend it by buying things from these local merchants. So these local merchants have a tangible benefit that they're getting from this general assistance program. It's just not as direct of a benefit as the people who are getting the money directly, or the administrators who are implementing the policy. So they're a little bit more removed, but they're still considered to be secondary stakeholders in that policy. So as you are working on your pre-instructional assignment, and when you get to that third part where you are brainstorming who are some of the stakeholders who are involved in this policy, think about it from that perspective. You know, think about what individuals and what groups are being either directly or indirectly impacted by this policy. If they are being directly impacted, chances are they're probably going to fall in the category of being primary stakeholders. If they are indirectly affected, they're probably going to fall in the category of being secondary stakeholders. So think through these stakeholders as you identify them in that paper, and consider, do you think they are primary stakeholders? Do you think they are secondary stakeholders? And hopefully that will help you then create that stakeholder section in your pre-instructional assignment. So I hope that this presentation kind of gives you some idea of some of the individuals and some of the groups who are involved in the policymaking process and how our system of the fragmentation of power in our system of government has an impact upon policymaking as well. Any questions or observations at this time on any of this material that I presented here in our first part of class?
Are we able to ask questions? Like I was thinking of secondary stakeholders for my my research paper. I'm doing this is Summer speaking. I'm doing the paid family leave, and I was just wondering if you had any ideas on my secondaries, because I was thinking, okay, employees would be stakeholders and government would be primary, but I was thinking like secondary. I'm not really sure.
Yeah, I would think that, the corporations, the businesses where these folks work, who are getting paid family leave, they're going to be stakeholders as well. I think they probably would be more primary because they are certainly going to have their bottom line is going to be affected by that. But I think you want to include them. I think that maybe as a secondary stakeholder, you could think about maybe some of the consumers who consume goods and services created by these companies, because that paid family leave could then have an impact upon the bottom line of the company, which then could have an impact upon the goods and services that they are creating. So maybe some of your consumers would fall in that secondary category.
Okay. All right. That's good. Thank you.
Sure. Glad to help. It's a good question. Okay, let's take a break. I know we're after 8 o'clock now, and you've been listening to me again, as I promised I wouldn't talk that much. And I guess I lied because I talked a lot tonight. But I do want to get all this information to you in preparation of getting that paper for next week. So let's take a break. Let's say we'll keep it short tonight. We'll take a break to 8:15, if that's agreeable with everyone. Run back at 8:15, and then I'll present some of these theoretical approaches that you'll then be able to use for your second beach board assignment. So take a break till 8:15. We'll come back and talk about theories. All right, welcome back. Hope you had a good break. I'm sorry, I apologize for having the smaller break than we would normally have tonight, but I do want to make sure that you get this information on theoretical approaches, since it's something you're going to have to use in your second beach board essay. And so I never want you to have to do an assignment without at least us discussing the information first. And so short break, but we'll get back to our normal breaks hopefully next week. So in the second half of class, what I'd like to do is talk to you a bit about some of the theoretical approaches that are useful for understanding policy and policy making. Some of these theoretical approaches you may be familiar with, especially if you were an undergraduate political science major, because they kind of play a large role in a lot of the political science theories, especially political science theories that have to do with urban administration. But first off, when we're talking about theoretical approaches, just to create a common playing field, what is a theory? I think it's important we know what a theory is. So let me ask you, what's a theory? Define a theory for me. What makes something a theory?
Hi, this is Connie. I would say a theory would be a framework, maybe, for some kind of narrative or topic.
Yeah, I like the characterization as a framework. A theory really is, it's a framework that helps us understand some type of phenomena. And it helps us understand kind of how the world works and how different elements of our world will relate to other elements in our world. So with a theory, what we do is we're creating a framework to look at the relationship between two, what we call constructs, two abstract constructs. An abstract construct is something that we generally feel that we know, but it's difficult for us to measure. So a construct could be something such as happiness. That's a construct. We all kind of know it when we feel it. We know, when we feel happy, when we feel unhappy. But happiness itself as a word is a construct. It's an abstract concept. In order to really measure happiness, we're going to have to develop operational indicators of what specifically we mean by happiness. So a theory could be looking at the relationship between happiness and quality of life. Happiness as an abstract concept and how it relates to quality of life as an abstract concept. But the problem with theories, because they're based upon abstract concepts and constructs, is that they're inherently difficult to measure. So what we typically do is we take our theories and we then distill them into what we call models. A model is a theory, but instead of being based upon abstract concept, they're based upon observable and measurable phenomena or observable and measurable variables. So we might take the idea of quality of life as an abstract concept, and in our model, we will then come up with specific ways of measuring it. So perhaps we will have an index for quality of life, where we'll ask a series of questions, and then we'll give people ordinal scores on all those questions, add up all their scores, weight the scores, and then that final index score will then be a reflection of this abstract concept of quality of life. So theories are general starting points, but then we have to take those abstract concepts in our theories and make them specific enough to measure. And when we do that, then we have a model. So a model is a relationship between these measurable types of variables, these measurable types of phenomena. So tonight, what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about theories. So these are going to be relatively general types of theories, but they will give us some insight in terms of who is making decisions in the policy process and why they make the decisions that they make. So the first theoretical approach we talk about tonight is what's called elite theory. And you may have, again, run into this if you were a political science undergrad. Elite theory basically says that when we're dealing with policy making, regardless of the topic of the policy, regardless of the issue at hand, you have the same stable group of decision makers. So you have this stable group of elite decision makers who are going to be making decisions across a whole wide swath of policy areas. So it doesn't matter if we're talking about housing policy or transportation policy, we are going to have the same elite stable group of decision makers who will be making those types of decisions. Elite theory really gained prominence in the 1970s from a political scientist by the name of Floyd Hunter. And Floyd Hunter did a case study of the city of Atlanta, Georgia. And what Hunter wanted to know is he wanted to know how decisions are being made in Atlanta, Georgia. So when he studied Atlanta, Georgia, he saw that there was this stable group of elites, top elected officials, wealthy business people, corporations that were common across all these different policymaking areas. One of the corporations that was common across all these areas, because it was Atlanta, Georgia, is, can anybody guess which corporation we're talking about in Atlanta, Georgia?
Coca-Cola?
Exactly, Coca-Cola. You know, Coca-Cola owns Atlanta, Georgia. If you ever go to Atlanta, Georgia, you go downtown, there are so many things downtown that are named after Coca-Cola. Even if you're in the South and you order a soft drink, you don't order it as a soda like people do here in California. You don't order it as a pop like people do in the Midwest. Everything's called a Coke because Coke is so dominant in Atlanta, Georgia. And so Coke was part of this elite stable group that was involved in the policymaking process, again, regardless of the policy topic. The counter to elite theory is this theory known as group, or I like to call it pluralism, pluralist theory. Pluralist or group theory can be traced back in political science to an author by the name of Robert Dahl, D-A-H-L. And Robert Dahl was a faculty member at Yale University. And so being at Yale University, obviously his case study was New Haven, Connecticut. So he wanted to see how decisions are made in the policy process in New Haven, Connecticut. What he found is instead of elite theory like Floyd Hunter found, he found pluralist theory, in that if people and groups were interested enough in policy making on this area, in this policy area, they could get involved and participate in the decision-making process. That it wasn't this stable set of leaders. Anyone who was interested, any individual, any interest group that was interested in this policy area could then be involved in the decision-making process. They could be involved in policy making. Pluralist theory is very similar to what we refer to in federalism as multiple crack theory. Now, Morton Grodson's developed this theory known as multiple crack theory, that there are multiple cracks and fissures throughout our political system, whereby people can use those fissures and use those cracks to participate in policy making. That's the same type of idea here with pluralist or group theory. So that's our second theoretical approach. Anyone who is interested has the opportunity and the ability to participate in policy making. Our third theoretical approach is called institutional theory. Institutional theory places a premium on the formal and the legal aspects of government structure. So we say the primary decision makers in policy making are going to be those governmental institutions who will use their structures and their rules in order to make policy. So if you want to understand how policy is made, you have to look at those formal institutions, those formal governmental institutions, because it's those institutions that are primarily responsible for policy making. A fourth theoretical approach is called rational choice theory. And this one comes from the world of economics. You're probably familiar with this one. Rational choice theory assumes that individuals are rational, self-interested actors. And as rational, self-interested actors, they will involve themselves in policymaking to maximize their benefits while at the same time minimizing their costs. So they will make decisions in the policy process that will benefit them the most while costing them the least. I think that's a compelling theory if you believe that individuals have similar access to information. So the problem with rational self-interested choice theory is that not everyone has the information necessary to properly determine what the benefits and the costs of a certain policy action will be. This information asymmetry could lead these rational self-interested actors to make irrational decisions in the policymaking process. So if you don't have the requisite information to know what the benefits of this course of action are, then you're probably going to maybe overestimate the benefits that you're going to get, and you will end up working counterintuitively against your own self-interest. So for rational self-interested choice theory to work, people need to have access to information to properly calculate their benefits and their costs to then guide their decisions and their actions in the policy-making process. So that's the problem with rational self-interested theory. Another theoretical approach is called political systems theory. In political systems theory, we understand policymaking by understanding the relationship between our institutions and individuals and the environment in which they operate. So we need to understand the social and the economic and the cultural context in which policy is being made, and how individuals and organizations interact within this social, economic, and cultural context. So if you've had organization theory, the 660 course, you've talked about systems theory and open systems theory. This is kind of your open systems theory. We look at the interrelationship between institutions, individuals, and their surrounding environments, kind of a biological or ecological model of politics in policy making. So we have to understand how individuals and institutions operate and interact within the social, economic, and cultural context of their ecology or their environment. So those are the primary theoretical models that we are going to be using in this class to try and understand the policy process and to try and understand who chooses to be involved in the policy process and how they act and how they behave within that policy process. So what then is the policy process? What does the policy process look like? We've been talking a lot about policy making, but there are several different stages in the normal policy process. And those stages usually begin with the first stage, which is agenda setting. Before a policy will be formulated, the societal problem or the issue must make it onto the formal decision-making agenda of a body, of a legislative body, of an executive organization, but it must first make it onto the formal agenda. There's a very famous person in policy who we're going to talk about in subsequent sessions, John Kingdon. And John Kingdon talks to us about this agenda setting part of the policy process. Kingdon basically argues that there are a lot of issues and a lot of societal problems that are floating around out there in what he refers to as kind of a primordial soup. So we've got this big primordial soup of issues there and problems that are all floating around. People are aware that these issues are there. They're aware that these problems are important, but they've never really taken those issues and forced them onto a decision-making agenda. And until they get onto that decision-making agenda, no policy will ever be made to resolve that problem. So they're all floating around out there in that primordial soup. When they get onto the formal decision-making agenda, that's when policies can be made. And they get onto that formal decision-making agenda when you have the right people in place to make policies on this issue, when you have an issue or a problem that is relatively well defined, and you also have what he calls a choice opportunity. You have like a window of opportunity where public opinion gets behind the idea of trying to solve this problem and trying to make a policy to address the problem. There's a decision-making model that's very similar to this called garbage can model of decision-making. And it's one of my favorite decision-making models in policy analysis. The garbage can model of decision-making, much like John Kingdon, says that issues become policies whenever you have what he calls the confluence of four different streams. And the four different streams of garbage can decision-making are the participant stream, the problem stream, the solution stream, which I just put two L's in because I'm talking and typing, the solution stream, and the choice opportunity stream, sometimes referred to as a triggering event. Now, this triggering event is what John Kingdon referred to it as. So when you have the participant stream, the problem stream, the solution stream, and the choice opportunity or triggering event stream all flow together, that tends to be where policies are made. An issue probably will not get onto the formal decision-making agenda unless we have an idea what the problem is about. So we have somewhat of a definition of that problem. We kind of know what the problem is, or we feel we know what the problem is. And we have the right decision makers in place who are willing to make a decision about this issue and willing to formulate a policy to address this problem. That's usually when things get onto the formal decision-making agenda. And I don't want to digress too much and go down this path too much, but in a lot of my classes, I talk about the idea of power and what power is. And we think about power as the ability to mobilize resources to make someone do something they otherwise would not do. So if you can influence someone to do something they otherwise would not do, you are exercising power over that individual. And one type of power that we see exercised is a type of power known as mobilization of bias. And mobilization of bias is the ability to keep something off of the formal decision-making agenda. And the example I always use comes from an author by the name of John Gaventa. And John Gaventa did this very famous study of a coal mine town in rural Appalachia. And he went into this coal mine town and he wanted to know how and why the coal mine owners were able to exert power and influence over the coal mine workers to get the miners to do things that were not in line with their self-interest. They were kind of counterintuitive. Things such as working in dangerous mine conditions, things such as working 70 and 80-hour weeks, things such as getting paid in tokens rather than getting paid in money, tokens that could only be redeemed in, you guessed it, the company store. So the only general store in town was owned by the coal mine company. And so you took these tokens that you got paid by the coal mine company, you went into the company store and you bought things using these tokens in the company store. So kind of the coal mine company got you, going and coming. They got you covered all around. So you want to know, why weren't the coal mine workers revolting? Why were they willing to accept this? And so he developed all these different types of power. And one type of power that he identified is this mobilization of bias. He said one of the reasons why the coal mine owners were so successful at exercising power is they were able to affect the agenda of the state legislature. They were able to keep coal mine safety policy off of the formal agenda of the state legislature. And they did that through relationships with state legislators, through campaign contributions and donations. They basically were able to grease the skids politically in order to convince these state lawmakers not to consider coal mine safety legislation in their session of the legislature. That's mobilization of bias, keeping things off of the agenda. Because if you can keep it off the formal agenda, no policy will ever be made. So in order to get onto the agenda, you need to have a problem that is defined, and you need to have the right participants in place, and hopefully a solution out there that you can apply to the problem to solve it, or at least to mitigate it. So you've got a well-defined problem, you have the right people who are predisposed to formulate a policy to try and solve that problem. You have solutions that you can select from to be the basis of your policy to solve that problem. Then all you need left is you need some type of triggering event. You need something to happen to galvanize public opinion around the idea that we need a policy. When something goes wrong and people are outraged by something, what do they normally say? There ought to be a law. That's what people are. There ought to be a law about this. Well, that law is a policy. So they're basically saying there ought to be a policy to address this. So when you can galvanize public opinion around the idea that this is a problem that is worthy of being solved, that's when issues get out of the primordial soup and move on to the formal decision-making agenda. And once they're on that agenda, then we can start talking about formulating policies. So once they're on the formal decision-making agenda, then you can move to the second stage of the process, which is policy formulation. This is obviously where we design and we draft our goals of our policy and put together strategies, solutions for achieving those goals. This is where a lot of policy analysis gets done. We need to come up with alternative solutions for how we can solve this problem, and then do analysis to determine which of these solutions is not necessarily the best one, but which of these solutions is the most appropriate one to become the basis of our public policy. That's what we call the policy formulation phase. Then the next stage is called policy legitimation. In policy legitimation, we mobilize political support and we formally enact these policies. And so this is what gives those policies legal weight. This is what gives them coercive power. is we are now going to pass this policy. This policy will now become law, and it now has legal standing. So we can now legally enforce that policy. So when the policy gets passed, it has that legal standing. That's policy legitimation. After policy legitimation, we then have policy implementation. We then have to go out there and actually implement that policy. So it's the provision of institutional resources for putting the programs into effect within the bureaucracy. So this is what we're actually going out there and implementing. And as I said before, there are still decisions to be made in the implementation phase. And we make those decisions through the rule-making process governed by the Administrative Procedures Act. So it's not all the formulations, not all done yet. Some formulation actually happens with how will we implement this policy and the programs that underpin this policy. Then the next stage is policy evaluation. Once we have implemented this policy for a period of time, we then go back and we measure and assess the policy to see if it's been successful at achieving our stated goals and objectives. So how much success have we had? What types of failures have we experienced? We then take that information about successes and failures that we got in policy evaluation, and then we use it in this final stage known as policy change. This is where we feed that information back that we got in policy evaluation. We feed it back through the process to either improve the design of the policy by reformulating the policy and sometimes getting rid of the policy altogether. Sometimes we'll funnel this information into the implementation phase, that if some of our failures have not been failures of design, but rather failures of implementation, then we'll feed this information back into the implementation phase in order to more properly and better and more efficiently implement this policy. But this policy change is your feedback loop. It's that big arrow that you would see in this flow chart, bringing all this information back to then make minor or sometimes major changes into our policies. Now, the fact of the matter is we don't oftentimes make a lot of major changes. You know, the changes we make tend to be relatively minor tweaks at the margins. We don't get a whole lot of major changes. The major changes we get to policies kind of will come in what I like to call fits and starts, in that we'll usually make marginal changes, and then all of a sudden we'll make a major change to a policy. We'll either fundamentally reform that policy, or you might get rid of that policy and completely replace it with a new policy. That's a process known as punctuated equilibrium. With a punctuated equilibrium type of approach, everything stays pretty much the same until you get to a point of critical mass where the failures are just too glaring for us to live with anymore, or the circumstances have changed so much that public opinion is really putting a lot of pressure on policymakers to make a fundamental change to that policy. And that's when you see that policy get changed. You can think about the Affordable Care Act in the Obama administration. That's kind of an example of a punctuated equilibrium type of model, in that we were making small little tweaks to healthcare along the way. You know, there was a major attempt to change healthcare in the Clinton administration in the 1990s that failed. And then after that, we had these small little marginal tweaks until we get into the Obama administration. Then we have this big change known as the Affordable Care Act, otherwise known as Obamacare, and kind of this punctuated type of equilibrium model. But those are the basic phases in the policy process and what kind of goes on in each one of those phases of the process. I'm not going to go through all the protracted discussion of it because I think it's pretty commonsensical. We've already talked about each of those phases, but those are the primary phases we tend to see in the policy process. What tools or what instruments can we then use to affect public policy? What tools can we use to achieve our policy goals? And these are called the instruments of public policy. Well, as we are implementing a policy, we can use things such as regulation. And last week we talked a lot about regulation. We can regulate the behavior of individuals and corporations and governments and regulate that behavior to achieve our desired outcome. So we may want to have regulatory policy whereby we regulate the price of utilities to make sure that people are able to get a staple of life like utilities, whether it be electricity or water or whatever the case may be. We regulate that. Sometimes we want to regulate the behavior in terms of the creation of pollution. And so we will regulate the amount of pollution that can be created. We can have regulation in terms of issuing licenses for people to engage in certain types of behavior and certain types of activities. So regulation is a major instrument that we use in order to achieve our policy goals. Government management is another instrument that we use in public policy to try and achieve our policy goals. With government management, we're talking about the management of the direct services of providing this policy and implementing this policy. So one example of government management as an instrument could be privatization. So we decide that we are going to privatize some element of this policy. So we're going to privatize our transportation services in a school district, or we're going to privatize cafeteria services in our correctional facilities in the state. That speaks to managing the provision of those services differently. That's government management. Oftentimes, like I said, it's privatization. We do a lot of privatization when we construct facilities in the public sector. That's why I've always been an advocate in this program for a core course in procurement and contracting, because if you work in the public sector, you probably know a lot of what we do in the public sector is in the fields of procurement and contracting, because we don't build our own buildings, we don't construct our own buildings. We put out requests for proposals, RFPs, and then we solicit bids and we hire contractors, private sector corporations, to do a lot of this work for us to achieve our ultimate policy goals. Taxing and spending are also instruments of public policy. Clearly, tax policy. We'll talk a lot about economic policy and tax policy coming up in about a week or so. Tax policy is a very big, important tool that we can use to affect the economic behavior of individuals as well as corporations and businesses. So we'll use our tax policy in order to shape consumer preferences. We'll use our tax policy in order to shape corporation decisions in terms of where to locate, how much to produce, what types of goods and services to produce. And so taxing can be a major instrument of policy. Taxing raises revenue. And so our ability to raise revenue will have a direct impact upon our ability to then spend on these public policies. So if we are unable to get a tax increase passed, we're not going to have the revenue that we need in order to pursue a policy solution to this societal problem. Spending policy, obviously, intuitively, is an important part of policy. So how much do we commit in terms of resources to policy A versus policy B? And so how much we spend will have a direct impact upon how successful we are at achieving our policy goals. Market mechanisms. And so we can use market mechanisms to try and control supply and demand of certain types of goods and services. A good example of this is e-commerce. So the national government had to make some very difficult decisions, especially in the 90s and the early 2000s, about how much to regulate electronic commerce. So they had to decide, Congress had to decide, should we allow state and local governments to tax electronic commerce? If we allow them to tax electronic commerce, then we are going to be contracting the demand for electronic commerce and affecting that supply and demand curve. How much do we want to regulate the content on the internet? The more we regulate the content on the internet, the more we are affecting the supply, and affecting the supply will then obviously have a direct impact upon the demand for those internet services. So we can use those types of supply and demand decisions, those market mechanisms, as a tool or an instrument of public policy. We can use market incentives in order to achieve our policy goals as well. So we can allow corporations to purchase permits that will allow them to then engage in additional emissions and pollution. So they purchase these permits, and then these are basically indulgences that they are buying from government that will allow them to then produce more emissions and produce more in the way of pollution. There's been a lot of discussion about using these types of permits for private vehicles as well. And so people, if they are going to travel a lot and use a lot of gasoline, a lot of fossil fuels, obviously that'll cause pollution, that'll cause wear and tear on the roads. And so therefore we'll charge them this permit, we'll give them this permit, we'll charge them for it to allow them to do this additional driving, then capture the revenue for that and use it for road reconstruction and for mitigating pollution types of concerns. So those are all those types of market mechanisms. Another instrument of public policy is education, providing education and information to citizens to try and persuade them to engage or not engage in certain types of behaviors. So public service announcements about the ills of tobacco consumption or the ills of vaping, education about vaccines and mask mandates and things like that are all done for the purpose of trying to shape individual consumer behavior in order to achieve our policy goals. We do this type of education a lot. We spend hundreds of millions of dollars per year on these public service types of campaigns. So we've got a lot of tools or instruments at our disposal that will help us then accomplish our policy goals. And these tools at our disposal, we will usually build into the formulation of our policy and then implement them as we are implementing the policy through policy implementation. Again, the tools that you select will depend upon the goals that you are trying to achieve and the policy that you are dealing with, the audience that you are dealing with at that given time as well. Different types of tools or instruments will work better for certain audiences as opposed to other audiences. So when we do this with our policies, when we formulate these policies and we create all these instruments to help us achieve our policy goals, we have typically in this country created 3 different categories of policies. And we mentioned these last time. They're called Loewy's typology of policies. Loewy's typology of policies, which is hard to say, creates these 3 different types of policies we see in this country: distributive policies, redistributive policies, and regulatory policies. As we defined last week, distributive policies are policies that distribute or give out benefits or resources without taking those resources from anywhere else. So these are new resources that we are giving to certain segments of society without taking those resources from anybody else. And so we're not redistributing them, they're brand new resources. We said last week, and we'll say it again this week, that there are not a lot of great examples of truly distributive policies because we have infinite demands being placed upon governments and we have finite resources. As long as we have those finite resources, we're not going to have spare resources out there to put toward these policies. So instead of being distributive in nature, the vast majority of our public policies are redistributive. We are redistributing wealth and resources from one segment of society to another. When we engage in redistributive policies, we have to consider those who are being benefited as well as those who are being harmed. Because whenever you are redistributing resources away from one segment of your society, at least initially, those members of that part of the society are going to be harmed by that redistributive policy. So there are a couple of what we call choice models that we can use to determine whether or not a redistributive policy is good policy, whether or not it's worthy of being pursued. One choice model, and I'll put these in text chat, is what's called the Pareto optimal model. In the Pareto optimal model, we would say that a policy is worth pursuing if it benefits at least one individual without harming anyone else. So in a purely Pareto optimal model, a policy is worth pursuing if it benefits at least one person without harming anyone else in society. So you can tell with the Pareto optimal type of model, we are really favoring distributive policies. That the only real policies that would work in a Pareto optimal model would be a purely distributive type of policy. Well, we already said that the vast majority of our policies are not distributive in nature. They're either redistributive or they're regulatory. So there's got to be another choice model that we can use in determining what is a good policy worth pursuing. And fortunately for us, there is. There's an economic model that is known as the Kaldor-Hicks model. And the Kaldor-Hicks choice model, we modify Pareto optimal a bit. So instead of saying that it benefits one person without harming anyone else, in a Kaldor-Hicks model, we say a policy is worth pursuing if it benefits at least one person and those who are harmed are eventually compensated. So it benefits at least one person initially. And we recognize that some people may be harmed, at least initially, by this policy, but eventually they will recoup that harm. Eventually, they will be compensated for the harm that they felt initially. So a great example of this is something like trickle-down economics. And back in the Reagan administration and the Bush administration as well, if I can spell, trickle-down economics, in both the Reagan and the Bush administration, they really favored this idea of trickle-down economics. So in trickle-down economics, if you're not familiar with it, but I'm sure a lot of you are, what you will do is you will have tax breaks for your upper income individuals. And so people at the upper strata levels of your income structure, those individuals will get tax breaks. So they will be benefited immediately by this new tax law. Those at the lower level, lower income individuals, will not get that benefit. So whenever you give a tax break, that's referred to as a tax expenditure, because by giving a tax break, you are reducing the amount of revenue that is flowing into the federal government. When you reduce the amount of revenue coming in, that's going to reduce the number of policies and programs that you can fund. So some of those policies and programs that benefit lower income individuals may have to go away or may have to be scaled back because we no longer have the revenue to pay for them. But it's called trickle-down economics because we're giving those tax cuts to upper income individuals, and then we are believing that those upper income individuals will then, with the money that they are saving, will go out there and stimulate the economy by creating jobs. So these are the folks who own businesses. So they'll take the money they're saving, they'll put it back into their business, they'll create new jobs in their corporations, and then people at the lower income level will then benefit from these new jobs that are being created. So they're harmed initially, but eventually they'll be compensated with economic stimulation and the creation of new jobs that they can then fill. That's kind of the idea behind trickle-down economics as an example of the Kaldor-Hicks redistributive approach to policy. Now, we know that sometimes those benefits don't really trickle down your income strata. We've also tried things such as what are called targeted capital gains tax cuts, where you're very familiar with what a capital gain is. And so, a capital gain, the capital gains tax rate is lower than the tax rate on wages because we don't want to double tax money. And so with capital gains, people ostensibly have already paid taxes on that money. So they invest that money, and then those investments they get are capital gains. And so they have a much lower tax rate for those capital gains. Well, sometimes we talk about having targeted capital gains tax cuts where we'll reduce that capital gains tax rate even lower. And we reduce it lower because we're trying to shape people's behavior. We're trying to incentivize reinvesting that money again and investing that money into the economy. Unfortunately, though, if we don't target those capital gains tax cuts, we're not guaranteeing that people are going to put that money back into the economy. They could just put that money back into their bank account or put it underneath their mattress or whatever they want to do with it. So instead, we have these targeted capital gains tax cuts so that we say, you will get this capital gains tax cut if you use the money to start a new business, or if you use the money to create more jobs in a corporation, then you get your capital gains tax cut. Again, that's an example of a Kaldor-Hicks type of model. It's an example of how we justify redistributive programs in this country. That those who are harmed will eventually be made better off and will be compensated in the long run. Now, our third type of policy, as we mentioned before, is regulatory policy. And we use regulatory policy to directly shape behaviors, regulating environmental quality through regulating emissions of pollution, regulating how people engage in running a business, regulating in terms of how people engage in free time activities with things like hunting licenses, fishing licenses. So a lot of different types of regulation. Again, of these three different types of policies, the ones we see frequently are redistributive and regulatory in nature. So given this Lowy typology of distributive, redistributive, and regulatory policies, what I would like for us to do now in the minutes that we have remaining is to think about your societal problem and what type of policy you think would be most effective for addressing that problem. Do you think a distributive policy, a redistributive policy, or a regulatory policy would be most effective? And again, so you don't have to listen to me talk anymore. Let's go ahead. A second here. And set up some breakout groups, and we won't spend a lot of time on this because I want to get you out at a reasonable hour anyway, but looks like we got about 14 people. So let's say we'll break it up into 3 breakout groups. I'm just going to assign people automatically. So let me create our 3 groups. Okay, our groups are created. I'm going to open up the rooms, and again, go into the rooms. We'll spend maybe about, we'll say 15 minutes in our breakout rooms. Think about your societal problem and think about which type of policy you think would be most effective. Also, when you're in your breakout group, if you could select one spokesperson, we'll reconvene as a class at about 9:15, and then we'll quickly share out what your groups came up with. So pick one spokesperson to then share the results of your group discussions. All right? Sound good? Okay. I'm going to go ahead and open up the rooms, and you will be off into your breakout rooms. Okay, it looks like we are all back in the main room, so thank you for participating in those breakout rooms. I want to get you out of here at a reasonable hour, so we'll do this quickly. But room number 1, your spokesperson, what did you come up with? That's a room with Connie, Jocelyn, Kimberly, Rudy, and Yvette.
I can do a quick recap for us. So we were talking about different policies related to homelessness and also different societal problems that we were seeing. And we came to the conclusion that a lot of it was related to redistributive, but also there might be some regulatory aspects to it as well. So that's kind of the consensus that our group came to.
Okay. Great, very good, and that's the point I was hoping that we would come to, and you've already come to, and that's that these are not mutually exclusive categories, like you said. Primarily redistributive, some regulatory elements. You certainly can have redistributive and regulatory elements combined together in the same policy approach. So, excellent. Thank you, group number 1. Group number 2.
I can go ahead. So I think it was kind of similar where we had a mix where some of our policies seemed a lot more like regulatory, where things kind of needed to be passed on a state level. For example, mine is food insecurity. So we thought that would be a more better approach for distributive policy, since that one's dealing more with like the welfare of constituents.
Good, thank you, Anna. And I also I like the you made mention to the state level as well. That's also an important part here. When we have redistributive and regulatory policies, we also then have to be concerned about which level of government has the primary responsibility. And we haven't gotten into it as much yet in this class, but the administration of these policies will differ depending upon whether we're looking at national or state governments or local governments. From the national level, the administration is much more indirect administration, and that's primarily the national government providing the resources to then make the production of the services possible. And so it's a very indirect type of relationship. At the state and the local level, the administrative relationship is much more direct because it usually will be the state or local government that is charged with directly implementing and administering the program or the policy. So national government tends to be indirect administration, state, local governments tend to be much more direct administration. So good. Thank you, Anna. And group number 3.
I'll go ahead and speak for our group. We kind of have the same thing as group 1, where for most of our societal problems, we thought it would be a mix of redistributive and regulatory. I think we kind of all landed first on redistributive, but then would need to supplement with some regulatory solutions as well.
Okay. Thank you, Sharon. Very good. And yeah, that tends, when we do this exercise, that tends to be the common approach, is that it tends to be redistributive with some regulatory elements. And so I'm glad that we all came to the consensus that, you know, these two policy approaches are not mutually exclusive and can actually complement each other. Very good. Okay, I appreciate that. I'll let you get out of here tonight because I know you probably already had a very long day. Remember, of course, you've got beach board essay number 2, as well as your pre-instructional assignment due next Thursday. When we get together next Thursday, our primary topic for the evening will be alternatives. We'll talk about how you develop alternatives, how you assess alternatives, which would be a very important piece of information, obviously, for then your next paper, where you're doing the lit review, annotated bibliography, and alternative development. And so we'll get through all that information next week to then make you able to then do your next written assignment. So that's all I have for you tonight. Thank you for being here. Thank you for participating. Hope everyone has a really great weekend. If you have any questions about your pre-instructional assignment, feel free to shoot me an email. Otherwise, I'll see you back here next Thursday at 7 o'clock. So thanks very much. Have a great weekend.
Bye, thanks.
Good night.